Support for today's episode comes from Amazon. Amazon is working toward a carbon free energy future, doing more with less, investing where it matters most, and supporting communities where we operate. The UAE is turning power readiness into an AI advantage. The UAE is not beating the US on power alone. It is showing what happens when power, capital, permitting, chip access, and national AI strategy get coordinated before construction begins, rather than assembled project by project after the fact. Stargate UAE is the clearest example yet of a pattern reshaping where global AI infrastructure gets built. The project, backed by G42, OpenAI, Oracle, NVIDIA, Cisco, and SoftBank, is a 1 gigawatt Abu Dhabi compute cluster, with the first 200 megawatts expected to go live in 2026. Other reporting has described the broader campus eventually growing well beyond that. Either way, the more instructive comparison for US executives is not the final size. It is how many separate pieces had to move in sequence, rather than in parallel, to get there. Speed came from coordination, not from power alone. What let Stargate UAE move this fast was not primarily land, labor, or even capital in isolation. It was that power, financing, permitting, and chip access were lined up together before the project broke ground, rather than negotiated one at a time. Mubadala-backed G42 and the investment firm MGX supplied capital that could commit to generation and grid infrastructure without the multi-year regulatory dockets a U.S. utility typically has to clear first. Microsoft has committed $15.2 billion in UAE investment from 2023 through 2029, including $7.9 billion planned specifically for 2026 through 2029, much of it aimed at expanding data center capacity in the country. In November 2025, the U.S. Commerce Department approved G42 and Saudi Arabia's Humane, each country's respective national AI champion, to purchase the equivalent of up to 35,000 NVIDIA GB300 systems, under specified conditions. That approval removed what had been the last major bottleneck. Power, capital, and hardware access arrived on the same timeline because a government and its state-linked partners planned it that way, not because any single input was simply more abundant. The same coordination is showing up elsewhere through different mechanisms. Stargate's second announced site outside the United States, in Narvik, Norway, reached a similar outcome through a different route. Rather than sovereign capital accelerating new generation, it drew on hydropower capacity the country already had in place. The initial 230 megawatt phase there targets roughly 100,000 NVIDIA GPUs by the end of 2026, with ambitions to add another 290 megawatts. Saudi Arabia's Humane received a comparable chip export approval alongside the UAE's. None of these projects rely on the identical mechanism, sovereign capital in one case, existing surplus generation in another, but each reflects the same sequencing. A government or state-linked entity resolved power, permitting, and hardware access as a package before asking developers to build. U.S. developers are assembling the same pieces, just one at a time. Many large-load AI projects in the United States face multi-year interconnection and transmission timelines rather than the coordinated runway Stargate UAE had from the outset. PJM's most recent interconnection cycle drew roughly 220 gigawatts of proposed generation, and more than 55 gigawatts have since cleared the queue. But transmission build-out and firm customer commitments remain the bottleneck standing between a cleared study and an operating project. That gap is part of why bring your own generation has become a common U.S. response, with hyperscalers, governors, and FERC all pushing variations of the same idea. If the grid cannot deliver power, capital, and hardware on the same schedule, developers assemble each piece themselves. In Texas, one operator secured a permit for 7.65 gigawatts of dedicated gas-fired generation rather than wait on grid connections, arriving at the Gulf model's logic out of necessity rather than coordinated state design. The difference is sequencing. Stargate UAE had power, capital, and chip access resolved before groundbreaking, while most U.S. projects are still negotiating one piece while construction is already underway on another. The competitive question isn't really about data centers. The infrastructure race unfolding in Abu Dhabi is framed as an AI story, but the underlying lesson applies to any capital-intensive facility a company might site anywhere in the world. Whichever government can resolve power, permitting, capital, and hardware access as a coordinated package, rather than leaving a developer to negotiate each one separately, is increasingly where large projects land first. For U.S. executives weighing where to place the next AI campus, semiconductor fab, or advanced manufacturing plant, the Gulf's advantage is not desert land or sovereign wealth on its own. It is that someone with the authority to coordinate all of it did so before asking a developer to break ground. And that kind of sequencing is still the exception rather than the rule, almost everywhere else in the world. Sustainability Soundbites energy coverage is sponsored by Amazon. Visit the link in our show notes to learn more about Amazon's Spotlight on Energy. For sponsorship opportunities with Environment and Energy Leader, please reach out to a member of our team.